My name is Skye Bartlett and I am the team manager of SAMESH and I'm also the guest curator of silhouettes. So silhouettes emerged from my brain with the help of many other people and that's how we put it together. So I'm a fashion historian and a historic fashion collector and I started doing some research into designers who had died of AIDS-related illness at the height of the AIDS epidemic in the 1980s and the 1990s. And that was kind of the genesis. I discovered a lot of designers that I'd never heard of, a couple that I was familiar with, and it just started the ball rolling. And the more I discovered, the more I realized that this was a really undocumented period of not just fashion history, but social history as well. So Chester Weinberg, I suppose, in many ways is one of the most important designers in the exhibition. Because this concept has never been done before, and what Timothy and myself were doing was discovering a bunch of designers who had made no lasting impact in fashion history, even though they were very influential at the time because their careers were cut short so suddenly. And no museum and no gallery has ever attempted to collect together as many of these designers as we have. And Chester Weinberg was our starting point because in 1985 he was the first designer in fashion to die of AIDS-related illness. And the stigma associated with HIV and AIDS at the time meant that he was effectively eradicated from fashion history despite his influence. He was the first American designer to be taken seriously in Paris. He was the contemporary and equal or better of Oscar de la Renta, Jeffrey Bean, names that are still familiar to the fashion consciousness. And Chester Weinberg, unfortunately, because he was the first, was a victim of that stigma and discrimination that helped eradicate him from fashion history. So we have 4 works by Chester Weinberg in the exhibition, which is the largest collection of Chester Weinbergs in the country. First time Chester Weinberg's ever been represented. But we have works from his very first collection in 1966, which was very influential and launched him into the spotlight. Beautiful little red linen suit, which is, it really characterizes his love of mod. And he influenced and introduced mod fashion to America. There's also a beautiful little cocktail dress in multicolored silk from his 1968 collection, which is incredibly beautiful. And probably my favorite, which is the 1968 evening dress, which is pink silk with the high-low hemline, or as we would say today, the mullet hemline. And that's a hemline that he, developed and is still incredibly influential in fashion today. So Ian and Marcel, very privileged to be able to include them in the exhibition as well. Their work has never been exhibited in Australia. The 2 works on display are the only 2 pieces in Australia. They're a design duo from Canada. They moved to London and they worked together. They were life partners and business partners. They would create the most luscious designs for fashionable bohemians and old money aristocracy. They were very expensive. They didn't produce collections. What they did was they would sit down with their client and create entirely bespoke garments. They would hand paint all of their designs onto silk. And the beautiful pajama set that is like a cascade of autumn leaves is incredibly beautiful. But they were very important because they led the British boutique movement in the 1980s, 1970s, 1980s, which was when designers created small boutiques that produced work. When they were both diagnosed with AIDS, they started to wrap up their business. They donated their atelier and most of their works to the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, which is their largest repository of work in the world. And they're important in the exhibition because they're one of the few designers who have actually had retrospectives. So their work has been studied critically by galleries. before. So the Victorian Albert Museum did a retrospective on their work in 1995, and there was another retrospective in Canada, their place of birth. So they're important because they have been studied critically and analysed critically before, which many of the designers in the exhibition haven't. So Halston was very famous for a very minimalist design aesthetic. In fact, towards the end of his career, the insides of his dresses had to have labels that said front and back because he stopped using zippers, he stopped using buttons. So it was sometimes quite difficult to work out which way you're putting the dress on. We don't have any of those examples in the exhibition, but we have a beautiful pink Grecian style dress, which was, it really highlights his sense of simplicity as a design technique. We also have one of his 1981 beaded fireworks dresses, which was right at the, I suppose, height of his talents, and just before he started to really over-license his name. He was also very famous for his use of a new material called ultra suede, which was a synthetic suede, which he incorporated into suits and dresses. So we have a beautiful blue and black wool ultra suede suit in the exhibition, which is really stunning. Halston started as a milliner, and then he moved into fashion. He became instantly acclaimed. He had a huge bankroll of celebrity clients. Liza Minnelli loved him, Elizabeth Taylor, all of the great movie stars and singers and actresses and actors loved his work. And he became very, very famous, very internationally recognized. But he kind of suffered business-wise. Even though he was successful, he over-licensed his name, and in the end you could get Halston carpet and Halston suitcases and Halston cigarettes. It was very bad. So it ruined his business, and he lost control of his legacy in 1983. And he stopped designing. He still designed for private clients, so he still made clothes for Liza Minnelli and when she was doing her concerts. But he lost control, which was a travesty because his name is synonymous with the disco Studio 54 era, where his designs were seen at their best. He was diagnosed as HIV positive in 1988, and he moved back to San Francisco from New York to be cared for by his friends and family, and he died in 1990. And that was very important history-wise because 1990 was when the fashion industry first started to pay attention to AIDS-related deaths in fashion. Fashion executives were very nervous to be seen to be acknowledging HIV and AIDS because they were worried that it would affect their bottom dollar. The homophobia and the stigma associated not only with being gay but being HIV positive was such that fashion executives really felt that it would affect their bottom line. And consequently, the 7th on Sale fundraiser initiated. That was because of Carolyn Rome and Anna Wintour, Donna Karan and Marc Jacobs, who were two very activated fashion designers, particularly because of the loss of their mentor, Chester Weinberg, were instrumental in the 7th on Sale coming about, and that raised millions of dollars for research and support for people living with HIV. And that wouldn't have happened if Halston hadn't have passed away of HIV related illness. And he was actually one of the first fashion philanthropists in that he left a clause in his will that said his beloved Rolls-Royce car had to be auctioned off to raise money for AIDS research. So that was a very classy and very Halston way of acknowledging both his illness and his cause of death. But that something needed to be done to raise funds and awareness for HIV and AIDS, not only in fashion, but in general. So Patrick Kelly is probably my favorite designer in the exhibition. He was born in Atlanta, Georgia, to a very poor black family. But he was very influenced by what he saw in Southern America, not only through the racism, which I'll talk about in a moment, that he saw there, but also black culture and Particularly, he was influenced by his grandmother who raised him, and he would watch her go off to church every Sunday, and she would spend a couple of days making a new outfit so that she would not be shamed in front of the other church ladies. So she was very thrifty and very creative, and should use old garments to create something new. He would also tell stories about how she couldn't, or they couldn't afford to buy matching buttons to repair his clothes. So he would have shirts with mismatched buttons, which is a technique that comes into his design over and over again. He moved to Paris and became an instant success. He was the first African American and the first American to be inducted into the Chambre syndicale de prêt-à-porter, which is like the French fashion guild that oversees the quality and excellence of French fashion. He was supported in that endeavor by Pierre Bergère, who was Yves Saint Laurent's partner, and Sonia Rykiel, the famous French ready-to-wear designer. He was most famous, I suppose, for incorporating elements of black culture into his designs that might be considered racist or demeaning. He would use Gollywog dolls, mammy faces, black baby dolls, grass skirts, banana skirts, watermelon wedges, all of this kind of sense of reclamation of these racist images into his work, which, you know, was very confronting but acclaimed because it forced not only the wearer but the viewer to, I suppose, take stock of their sense of racism. He was about to become literally the biggest fashion name in the world. He had a multi-million-dollar investor. He was going to launch perfumes, menswear, lingerie, when he failed to produce his winter collection in 1989 because he was so sick. And on the 1st of January 1990, he passed away at the height of his power. And like so many of the designers in the exhibition, his fashion house did not outlive him. We've got a beautiful boucle suit with mismatched candy ball buttons, which is a really, really beautiful piece. And it uses a material, boucle, which was famous in the Chanel suit. So very, you know, high fashion material, but with those mismatched buttons, he harkens back to his childhood. We also have a beautiful turquoise and black suit in the exhibition, which was worn on the runway by Rashumba Williams, who was one of the first black supermodels. And even though all the buttons are the same color, they're actually all different sizes. So it was a very subtle way of paying homage to his grandmother. So very, very stunning, very influential works there. He is he's starting to become a little bit more recognized, which is really great. The Museum of Fine Arts in San Francisco just finished Patrick Kelly Runway of Love, which was a major retrospective exhibition on his life and works. So it's really great to see his legacy be explored a little more. Franco Moschino was an absolute master. He was the son of an ironmonger who had a foundry, and his parents wanted him to go into the family business, but he was not having any of that. He ran away from home to become an artist and study art. And he became a sketch artist for a new designer called Versace, who you might have heard of. And he also became a sketch artist for Giorgio Armani before he launched his own collection, Moschino Couture. And instantaneously he was very acclaimed because he was very whimsical. And he always had a sense of activism in his work, which is very prevalent even from his very early collections. And that's something that carried through his entire design life. He was an advocate for all sorts of causes, environmental causes, drug rehabilitation causes. And he, I suppose most famously, hated the elitism of fashion, which is ironic considering he made a fortune in fashion and was very desirable from a consumer perspective. But the elitism of fashion he hated in particular. And we have a beautiful example of this work in the exhibition, which is his Chanel parody dress, which is a very famous example of his work and one that the House of Chanel actually sued him over. He did He did a collection where he parodied Chanel No. 5, the perfume. In fact, no, parody is probably too weak. He plagiarized. And he did that as a form of activism. He did it very deliberately. Towards the end of his life, he was very involved in AIDS activism. And some of his very late design works feature the red AIDS ribbon, which obviously came about in about 1991. And we have a beautiful vest in the exhibition where, in typical Moschino style, he turns the red ribbon into a love heart, which is really, really lovely. He died in 1994 of complications from a previous surgery, but his death was AIDS related. And rather than not acknowledge his death as being AIDS related, the House of Moschino, which is only one of two in the exhibition that still exists, lent into his AIDS status quite heavily and used that again as a form of activism. The year after his death in 1995, Rosella Giardini, who was a friend of Moschino's and took over as creative director, designed the beautiful black blazer with the silk foul AIDS ribbon appliqued to the back, which is a really stark but really stunning way of including that AIDS ribbon concept into fashion. Even now, Jeremy Scott is the current creative director, and in 2018 he did a collection with H&M, which featured condom imagery quite heavily. And that collection sold out within 7 minutes, apparently. Pieces are very hard to source now, but the beautiful little condom handbag that says Moschino on one side and ready to wear on the other, as a really cute little homage, not only to ready to wear fashion, but that condoms are ready to wear at any point in time as well. And the ridiculous Swarovski, covered condom earrings and necklace are just the right kind of ridiculous to be amazing. So his work is particularly wonderful, and it's really great that we were able to include those in the exhibition as well. A very rare example of menswear in this exhibition. Mostly it is women's wear, but one of his first, in fact, his first cheap and chic collection for men is that beautiful shirt which says Orsa Maggiore and Orsa Minore, which is Italian for Little Bear and Big Bear, the constellations. So that was Moschino's way of injecting queer culture into everyday fashion, which I think is particularly synonymous with Moschino's work. He was a very openly gay man. He was involved in bear culture, in leather culture, and he incorporated a lot of those different subcultures into his works in general. Australian representation was difficult to source for the exhibition because not only was Australia not affected in the same way as Europe and particularly America, but the fashion industry was affected very differently in Australia. Two great Australian designers, artists, activists that were of note were Peter Tully, the famous jewellery designer and artist, and David McDermott, the famous artist. He also worked with Peter Tully, who was his partner at one point, and they would hand paint fabrics for Linda Jackson and Jenny Key, and their boutique Flamingo Park in Sydney. But I suppose one of the most poignant pieces in the exhibition is the quilt panel that they made for their friend Carlos Benici. So Peter Tully and David McDermott collaborated on that quilt panel, and it shows Carlos dancing at an event that he went to as Miss Malta in homage to his Maltese heritage. And it's a really beautiful hand-painted quilt panel. Very beautiful work by two great Australian artists. And when they visited Carlos when he was dying in hospital, they told him that they wanted to do this panel and how they felt about it. And Carlos responded with, "Just make sure it's funny, darling," which I think is a really, really lovely story about how they infused that sense of irreverence into his quilt panel. So being able to show the entire block, which I believe is block number 9, was a real privilege because the AIDS memorial quilts are not necessarily fashion, but this panel was created by two people involved in the fashion industry, and in a very fashion way. It has the tutu and all the gold lame and the purple brocade. It's a way of showing that fashion crosses over into many other elements of art and activism. So I suppose, speaking of art and activism, Brenton Heath Carr was a brilliant artist and activist who lived in New South Wales. He resisted being called a fashion designer or his works being titled as fashion. But what we were able to do is incorporate three, in fact, of his most famous works, which used fashion in a way, in a very subversive way. So I suppose you have the image at the back of Gingham Woman, which is a woman completely covered in purple and white gingham. And that is almost a copy of what Jean-Paul Gaultier did on his runway that year. And Brenton Heath Carr was directly influenced by the work of a famous fashion designer. In Tom, we see a costume created from one of the 20th century's most subversive fashion icons, which is Tom of Finland. So he uses the muscle-bound leather man to cover his body and make a statement about masculinity. And he wore that when he marched in Mardi Gras, and he caused an instant sensation, and everyone wanted to be photographed with him. It's an amazing costume that he also went on to do a photo series with, of Tom at home. So Tom is scrubbing the floors and doing the dishes and things like that, which is really, really great. And in the third piece that we have of his, we see another subversive fashion icon in Betty Page. So again, Brenton Heath Carr uses Betty Page, this very female body type, to transform himself and make a statement about a woman's role, I suppose, in that he used a very famous bondage dominatrixy style to make a very sex-positive statement about femininity. I suppose, which is a work that's not included in the exhibition, but Brenton Heath Carr's most personal work was when he was commissioned for the opening of Don't Leave Me This Way, Art in the Age of AIDS at the National Gallery in 1994. He was commissioned to do a performance work at the opening, and what he did was he wore a see-through latex suit, and he was cannulated, catheterized. He had his drip on a pole that he was carrying around with him. He died a year later, so he was already very sick at that point. So for one of the first times, he used his body rather than taking on somebody else's to make a statement, and a very moving statement. Brenton Heath Carr isn't very well known outside of New South Wales. It's the first time that Tom and Betty have ever appeared in South Australia. It'll probably be their last because they are both getting very fragile. They were made to be worn to one event, and then their importance was seen later. So we were very privileged the Museum of Applied Arts and Sciences in Sydney allowed them to come over and let the South Australian public see these incredible works. So I feel very privileged and very honoured that I was able to collaborate with a small group of very invested individuals, and to discover the lives of these designers, many of whom I'd never heard of, and many of whom are relatively forgotten, to the point that we actually sourced a bunch of the exhibits from eBay, and we did not pay very much for them because they're relatively unknown. A Halston auction could go for $10,000. and some of the designers in the exhibition who are just as good as Houston will go for considerably less because their legacy has been forgotten. So I feel very privileged that I was able to rediscover. I guess my big takeaway from this exhibition was fashion's very important. It protects us, it keeps us safe, it keeps us warm. So I wanted to use fashion, I suppose, as a metaphor for the AIDS epidemic and as a symbol of people who did not feel protected, who did not feel safe, and how people can be drawn in by fashion, but hopefully will learn something. So one of the wonderful reviews that we got was, it basically summed it up with "come for the fashion, stay for the activism." And that's really what I wanted to do. I wanted to lure people in with a pretty dress and then slap them around with some very, very cold facts about stigma and discrimination. So I'm very privileged that I was able to do that. That my role as team manager at SAMESH and with my work with Thorn Harbour Health and Shine SA allowed it to happen, and of course the David Roche Foundation for being such a beautiful venue to be able to put the exhibition on. My ultimate hope will be that this will be a starting point. We've done a lot of research that has never been done before. In fact, some of the dietetics are now wrong. Some of the information in the catalogue has now been updated as we have discovered new things. So it's a very learning at all the time process. So I hope someone will carry on what we have done and take it even further. That's what I want to see. More education and research into this area, and then I'll feel that I have done something to help.